Hi there, I'm Judy Holland, and welcome to Happy Nest, the podcast where you can hear the latest research and best advice for living well when your kids leave home. Join me as I interview experts and explore how to reinvent yourself during this critical passage. I hope you'll head over to judyhollandauthor.com and check out my new book, Happy Nest, Finding Fulfillment When Your Kids Leave Home. Welcome to another episode of Happy Nest. I'm here today with Michelle Fiordaliso, who is taking a mom's empty nest gap year. If you like what you hear, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe, rate, and review the show. It's easy to do on Apple Podcasts, or you can go directly to the podcast section of my website at judyhollandauthor.com. After raising her son Joe by herself, then dropping him off at Pace University to pursue an acting career, writer Michelle Fiordaliso is taking a sabbatical of sorts. She went on a solo 18-day pilgrimage along the Camino de Santiago in Spain, hiking 15 to 17 miles a day in the mountains, staying in hostels and carrying her possessions in a 12-pound bag. Along the Camino, Michelle found she was moved 1,000,000 times a day by beauty, nature, and human kindness. Walking for miles, Michelle pondered the gifts she has gained from parenthood. She's able to focus on what she has rather than what she is missing. While fear still sneaks up on her, Michelle no longer lets it consume and control her. She's learned to relinquish control, let go, trust, appreciate little things, and find what brings joy. Michelle says she watches other parents fret about their fledglings, but she accepts that her son must grapple with difficulties in life to fully develop. It's a natural impulse as a parent to want to shield them, but it's the irritations or the sand in the oyster shell that helps create the pearl. On the Camino, Michelle found a great community and learned that spirituality is about that which connects all people. Michelle, welcome to the Happiness Podcast. I'm so glad to talk to you again.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Michelle, why did you take this 18-day trip on your own?
Well, the short answer is that I really didn't know what the hell else to do. I had put an offer on a house which was approved, and therefore in upstate New York. I was living in Los Angeles, and so I quit my job, gave notice on my home of 13 years, and then life had another plan for me. And so the deal fell through, and I had no idea what I was going to do next. And I went to sleep one night with this begging sort of question on my mind, and woke up with an email from someone who I hadn't heard from in years, who was inviting me to come to Europe. And that was it. Sort of was like asked and answered, I figured. And I believe God speaks to us through all sorts of interesting and peculiar outlets. And then after that, it just started to shape up into this similar 2-month trip, only one part of which was doing the Camino de Santiago. And it ended up being a very parallel trip to a trip that I took when I first found out that I was pregnant almost 20 years before, the same months, a lot of the same countries, only in reverse. So the end was the beginning, a kind of do-over, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And the Camino, but why did you decide to do this walk? Isn't this grueling? Isn't this kind of scary to like mosquitoes bite you? Why did you decide to do this, the Camino?
I tend to, part of my problem in life is that I tend to choose the hard path. So not only did I choose to do the Camino, but I chose the Primitivo, which is sort of a more isolated path, it's the road less traveled. Actually, it's literally the road less traveled as compared to the Camino Frances. And it goes through the mountains. I felt pretty physically fit. Just a few months before I had run a marathon. And so I had trained for about 8 months. So it was not so much the grueling physical nature of it that was intimidating, but it was more the kind of being in the forest, being in the middle of nowhere. I do speak Spanish, so that wasn't really a fear for me, but just sort of being alone. And after having had such a really structured life for so long with raising a kid and having a big corporate job, having no structure other than to wake up and walk was maybe the most intimidating part of all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine. So, Michelle, your journey into motherhood began with an unplanned pregnancy. That was followed by a stroke when you were 9 months pregnant. Then you and Joe's father split when he was 2 months old. And I know when we spoke for my Happiness book that you told me that you managed to support yourself and your son for a while on $12,000 a year. That is just mind-blowing, that whole array of events. And look how strong and wonderful you've come out today. How, though, in the midst of all that, Michelle, how did you manage all of that?
Well, how do you think, Judy? I wish I could say that I managed it with grace and ease, but to talk about it in a highly intellectual term, I'd say it was a shit show. And I was 27. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, and there was probably a lot of fumbling around in the dark and figuring it all out as I went along. I'm a regular journal keeper, and I have kept journals or diaries or whatever you call them for about the last 25 years. And I recently reread them, and I would say I was pretty lost, but I also managed to remain tethered to faith in some way. And that's probably what got me through.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about spirituality and faith. But from my understanding, the people that walk the Camino that's a really spiritual experience, right? Tell me about the spirituality of walking. Was it 15 to 17 miles a day on your own? What messages do you come down to you? What did you pull out of that?
So many, and I guess we can talk about a few of them. But one of the things that's helpful about the Camino is that you have a clear destination, and often in life we don't, and so that can be a big relief. I mean, you know where you need to get to, and you know more or less the amount of miles that you need to walk each day. I ended up walking a lot less of the time alone than I anticipated, which was really lovely. It's kind of like being in the Wizard of Oz, where like you're kind of walking along, and then you meet this character and you meet that character, and all of a sudden you're kind of linked arm in arm, skipping your way along. Yes and no, that's partly in jest, but it really is like that. I mean, you have these kind of archetypal people that you meet that are critically important to the questions that you're asking. Just for example, I walked for a long time with a woman who was a few years older than I am, but also had a very challenging finding out that she was pregnant. She had a teen pregnancy, and even though we were about the same age, she was just about, had just had her first grandchild. But we went through, and she's from this tiny island, Minorca, in the Mediterranean, and I'm from a metropolis, New York City, and yet our experiences were so much the same in terms of the shame that comes along with an unplanned pregnancy, the kind of having way more responsibility than you know what to do with, and kind of having to figure out life as you walk along. And so just having somebody like that on my path who really mirrored some of my experiences and was able to empathize was miraculous.
Yep. And I bet that really makes you feel connected to the rest of the universe. I mean, because this was it's not a random person walking next to you, because she also chose to walk that trail. Mm-hmm. Right. But I bet that was learned from this, that there's a lot of common ground that we have with others if you reach out and communicate, I imagine.
Absolutely. And I mean, even things like, I do a very not popular kind of yoga called Kundalini yoga. And she's a Kundalini teacher, I mean, it was like, how does that happen? It's hard to believe that those things can be purely coincidental.
Right. Well, yeah. So can you and I spoke before on this kind of Buddhist concept that everything's impermanent, including life. Can you expand on that for us?
Did I say that? If so, I might want to take it back. I mean, no, sure, things are definitely impermanent. Situations are impermanent.
Raising a child is a impermanent, brief kind of stretch of time.
Raising dogs a little bit different. They're the babies that never grow up, but as you know better than I do. But I was on a Pema Chodron retreat earlier this year, and they were talking about how feelings only last 90 seconds, and then we have to keep feeding that kind of feeling with narrative. We have to keep ourselves in a state of despair or anger, that the body doesn't physiologically want to feel anything for more than a short period. And even though relationships change and end, and obviously living things, including all of us, die at some point, whether we want to face it or not. I recently watched or rewatched Moonstruck for the umpteenth time, and Danny Aiello just died, which is sad. And the Olympia Dukakis character, she keeps using people's fear of death to explain everything from frugality to infidelity. And but I do think that this notion of impermanence allows us to hold on with a looser grip. And I guess, at the risk of sounding hokey, love, I think, over time is the only thing that isn't impermanent. I mean, I really believe real love never dies.
So we also spoke about, you told me that while fear sometimes creeps toward you, that you no longer let it consume and control you as you once did. What about that? How did you manage that?
I think fear is an interesting thing that every person has to contend with, because it's part of our physiology to feel fear and respond from fear. And I spent a lot of time in the early part of my life trying to build a persona of fearlessness. In fact, I even earned the moniker Fearless Fiordaliso because I was a licensed skydiver. I owned a motorcycle. I did a lot of things that I'm sure made my parents crazy. But I was more like Georgia O'Keeffe, who says, I've been absolutely terrified every moment of my life, and I've never let that keep me from doing a single thing I wanted to do. I mean, I think that fear is a muscle, but so is faith. And it's like going to the gym. You always see that person that's like always working their upper body or always working their quads. And I think you have to pick which muscle you're going to exercise. And I've just learned to exercise the muscle of faith more than I exercise the muscle of fear. I mean, that doesn't mean that I'm not really scared a lot of the time. I mean, the night before I left for the Camino, I was at my friend's house in London, and I felt completely paralyzed. I was so afraid of taking a step forward that I just sort of sat there and sobbed. But the next day I got on the plane to Spain, and the day after that I started walking. But the fear was immense for a period.
And you were shelters, or not shelters, like what not shelters, what were they, like were they open to the...
A friend of mine recently misunderstood and said, I thought you had to just like hope that somebody would let you stay at their house. And that's not the case. I mean, there are people that do the Camino and stay in hotels, but the most common way to do it, and there are other people that stay in tents, but the most common way to do it is to stay in albergue, is what it's called, which is kind of like the word for hostel. And it's kind of like a big room with bunk beds. And so you get your bunk, and there's a shared bathroom.
A lot of people in that room?
A lot of people. I mean, it could be 3, it could be 30. And or more. And, and people are snoring and farting and their feet smell. And it's not glamping at all. It's pretty humbling
Yeah.
conditions.
But that's certainly really outside of your comfort zone to sleep in a really different place like that. Is that part of it? Is that part of what does it connect you to the other people?
I think so. I think it's communal. I think it's equalizing. I think that community is really a part of the world that is lacking. I think that our feelings of isolation and separation are really damaging us, and there is not a sense of community. And they talk about how a lot of the PTSD when soldiers come back, sure, it's about what they saw and what they experienced, but a great deal of it is because they've communed with a group of other people, and now they have to separate from that. And I think about that even with my son, who's a musical theater performer, and you see what happens when the kids do a show and how being in that communal environment really changes them, and how depression sets in the days after a show ends, and they have to separate from that little bubble. And so I do think that a big part of the Camino is about that communal experience that is equalizing, where everyone is living under the same conditions, eating the same food, hearing the same noises. It's uncomfortable in moments, but it really is equalizing in a
Well,
transformative
talk to
way.
me. What are the gifts that you gained from the Camino? What else did you take away from the journey? And I know you talked to me about hurting your toe or your foot, right? And having to accept
Yeah.
help from others, which is difficult for you. Tell me about that.
Well, that was I tend to laugh at these things. I have learned to set down my victim mentality over life, and so when things happen, I tend to get curious and say, okay, God, what's this about? And so I did my first day on the Camino. We picked up some people, a la Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. I, picked up a Tin Man and a Cowardly Lion and a um, and uh, and I took off my shoes because your feet really hurt at the end of going up and down mountains for miles and miles. And I was having a wonderful time in the garden. It was sunny. I was barefoot, and I decided to or bang my toe on a big stone, and so it wasn't even on the Camino that I broke my toe, and I broke my pinky toe, and I kind of sat there having a conversation with myself, like, okay, well, I came all this way, and maybe now I have to stop. And I got up around 11 to go to the toilet and couldn't even put
Oh,
any pressure on it at all, and had to hop. And I kind of let it go. I surrendered and said, if I'm not meant to walk, I won't walk. And but the next morning I woke up, and one of the men that I met, put medicine on my foot. He taped my toe to the other toe, and it still hurt like crazy. But I decided to walk anyway, and people helped me along the way. And this particular gentleman carried my pack for sort of the last kilometer or two of the day, um, and I think that was the lesson. The lesson for me was, this is the start of doing something differently. I raised a kid by myself. I lived on the opposite side of the country as my closest friends and family, and that was a way I was very comfortable with. But the way of accepting help, the way of learning to receive, and the way of learning to be taken care of, and that was all new for me. That was out of my comfort zone, and especially with men, because I didn't raise my son with a dad in the house. That I had to admit that I had become somewhat hardened to men, and that I was going to have to soften into the care of men, and into my perception of them, which I think was also incredibly important as the mother of
mm-hmm.
a son.
Yeah. No, fascinating. Well, so now that you're an empty nester and your son is thriving and in a really artistic, interesting direction, if you look back, there was a lot of struggle being a single mother. What are the gifts that you gained from parenthood?
Oh, the gifts are just endless, but as I'm sure you know, and they're always surprising. I mean, humility, for one. I mean, I'm a person that is perfectionistic and likes to do things well and do things right. Um, and parenthood is not easy. And anyone that says they've aced it is probably,
Missing something.
full of shit. Because at the end of the day, when you've had to make 100 choices of what to say to your kid or what to do, if you go to bed feeling like you made 51 of those choices right, that's like a rock star kind of stellar day. Someone told me that evolution goes forwards, not backwards. So I kind of think it's a myth that we're here to teach our kids things. I mean, they're here to teach us. So our job is to keep them alive until they know how to do that on their own. And maybe to teach them a good recipe or two, like a solid lasagna. And but the job is really just to love them. That's it. And so, I mean, my son taught me and continues to teach me how to stop being so controlling, how to be more joyful, how to relax, how to sing and dance, how to loosen up. There's a million things, but humility, I would say, is the thing. I think human beings get into a lot of trouble when we start to get cocky.
Well, so Michelle, what's your goal now? What are you finding in this new phase of life? Where do you want to steer the ship now?
Well, if you have a crystal ball over at your house, Judy, I wish that you could tell me, because I feel like I've spent the last year and a half kind of getting out of the business of goals, and you're talking to like a master list maker and goal setter here. So I've been really working on getting into the business of surrender, of just seeing where the path takes me, of meeting each day as it comes. And this is really new for me. So, and I know for the person that's out there saying, well, what about the bills? I'm currently reading a book called The Surrender Experiment by Michael Singer. And he became a multi-millionaire living that way, just sort of seeing who he met every day and who crossed his path, and learning to listen to his intuition and trust his instincts, which is a lot harder to do when you're raising a child, because you're steered by the needs of the people that you share a home and family with. Forcing things might work, but allowing seems to be making space for flow and miracles to show up in my life. And I forced for a really long time, and I made good progress doing it that way. But this way seems to be more fun and more interesting. So I don't really have a concrete answer as to where my life is going to go. I just know that I'm kind of taking it day by day.
But you are a thinker, a writer, a filmmaker. You've been, right, and currently coaching, or an executive coach. So this is kind of your business, figuring out how we approach life in the second half. This is a big theme in your life, isn't it? Figuring out these things and trying to pass them on to others in different forms.
It does, although I would say that my methodology is changing, or is being asked to change by life. And I think that I do think that we have patterns, and I do think that you need a third party sometimes to, observe those patterns. I was working with a client on the phone last night, and she was, had seemed like she was really in despair and stuck, but I was able to see she had kind of um, made this change in so many other parts of her life, and she was just sort of kind of reaching the final frontier, that it wasn't like, oh, this same thing showing up again to rear its ugly head. It was more like, no, you got to practice the same thing on areas of your life that weren't as important to you, and now you've got to apply it to an area that is very important. But so I would say that the kind of forcing and goal setting and manifesting that I worked so hard to do myself, and to also teach to clients, and through the things that I wrote, and the books I wrote, the articles I wrote, I think is really shifting. I think it is really more about how to tolerate uncertainty, how to trust, or maybe not tolerate, but embrace uncertainty, and how to trust that the things that need to find you will in fact find you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you told me you've seen other parents worry, friends, maybe acquaintances of yours, worry about every little thing with their children as the kids are growing up. And even now, as the kids have left the nest, a lot of them are anxious and worried. Is that inevitable? Is there some way around that?
Um, yes, I think so, because I think this goes back to the sentiment that I made a few minutes ago about evolution moving forward, and that and our kids being here to teach us. I think a second part of that is that our kids are really on their own path, and by the time they've gone off to college or to take a gap year or to travel or whatever it is that they're doing, they should know how to brush their teeth, and they should know how to tie their shoes and at least get themselves fed when they're hungry, and that their path is really their own. Like my son will say to me, I'll want to steer him away from mistakes the way that all parents, I imagine, want to. And he'll say, Mom, I need to make my own mistakes and then learn from them. And that, having reread my journals, I made plenty of mistakes, and I learned from all of them. And so kind of trusting that our kids are on their own path. I think that helicopter urge to kind of be so involved with our kids, may come from our own incapacity to be with ourselves and to fill our own time, and to start to derive meaning from our own lives separate from the task of raising children. And I seem to be able to embrace uncertainty more than the average person, and I get that that's unique about myself, but I do think that when we're overly focused on our kids, we need to step back and say, who are we and how do we live our own lives more fully? Because I think that that's the biggest gift that we can give our children is being parents with kind of whole and interesting lives ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So, wrapping up, Michelle, what is your advice for people in the second half of their lives? With any luck, I guess we're in the second half of our lives. What do you do a lot of soul searching and reading and thinking in this area. What are your tips?
Well, I think there was a misbelief that this second half of life is kind of a winding down. I mean, I really disagree with that, especially as you and I have spoken before about fitness. I mean, I ran a marathon at 45, and I don't think I would have had, even though I wanted to run a marathon and it was a lifelong wish since my early 20s, I wouldn't have had the mental fortitude or the discipline to be able to train until I was in my mid 40s. And I sort of grew up with this kind of silly wish that, like, the age I was most looking forward to was 52. And maybe that was because I knew I'd finally be playing with a full deck, but I don't know why. I mean, I'm not there yet. I'm 5 years away. And I still think that seems like a great time of life because you're more grounded in yourself by then. And I just watched the Dr. Ruth documentary recently, which is just great. And her career as we know it just didn't even get started till she was nearly 50. And so this gives me great hope. And I really believe that raising kids is just one thing that we do. And for me, at least, I kind of feel like the best is yet to come.
Mm-hmm. Now that's wonderful, and those sentiments are backed up by a lot of researchers that look at the second half of life, and at this particular period in time, they say this is not your parents' empty nest. People are living healthier, longer, exploring more things, and for many people, and for most of us, this can really be the very best phase. It's different, it's less busy, and it's a little more internal. And if you can,
Yeah.
and I think a little more, there are some bigger questions that come to your mind that you didn't have time to consider before when you were driving Joe to the bus, right?
For sure. And there was less the frantic need to just get through a day, bath, the books, and bed, or, and you have all these really great writers like Marianne Williamson has a great book about middle age. David Brooks has a great book about middle age. And I think you're right. It is more quiet and insular. But also you have people doing great things because they're doing things from their authenticity and from their heart, rather than what they believed they were supposed to be, or they just want to make money, or they just want to be famous or ambitious, or anything like that. So I think there's the opportunity for a lot more truth and passion and realness.
Right. No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I wish you all the luck on your mom's gap year or gap years that you're embarked on now. And I hope to see you in DC when you come in for a landing. And thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. I really appreciate them. And I think it's really phenomenal what you've juggled and what you've done. And I can't wait to see Joe on Broadway.
I can't wait to see him on Broadway too. And I can't wait to see you in DC and hopefully the cherry blossoms. And thank you so much for having me. It's been great to be here with you.
You bet. Thanks so much, Michelle. Thanks for tuning into my Happiness podcast, where we explore how to get the best out of the empty nest. I hope you'll subscribe, write a review, and reach out to me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Check out my website, judyhollandauthor.com. Have a great day, and remember, make it happen.